January 16th, 1809. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the port city of Corunna in northwestern Spain, and the most revolutionary military experiment in European history is about to face its ultimate test. British forces, outnumbered 3-1 by Napoleon's finest marshals, are conducting a fighting withdrawal that will either validate a completely new approach to warfare or end in the destruction of an entire army. At the center of this desperate action stands a single British general whose tactical innovations have already begun to transform the nature of military conflict across Europe. His soldiers move with a speed and precision that confounds their French pursuers, fighting according to principles that seem to violate every established rule of 18th century warfare. They operate in small, independent units that can appear anywhere on the battlefield, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before conventional forces can respond. Picture this moment. You're watching from the hills above Corunna as columns of British infantry conduct what appears to be a conventional retreat toward the harbor, where Royal Navy ships wait to evacuate them to safety. But something about their movement is different. Wrong, according to everything you understand about military science. These aren't the rigid formations that have dominated European battlefields for centuries, but something altogether more fluid and dangerous. The soldiers wear green jackets instead of the traditional red, carry rifles instead of smoothbore muskets, and fight according to tactical principles that emphasize individual initiative over mass formation. Most unsettling of all, they seem to be winning their engagements despite being heavily outnumbered, using methods that conventional military wisdom declares impossible. What you're witnessing is the birth of modern special forces warfare, the moment when military science took a revolutionary leap forward that would influence combat operations for centuries to come. The general commanding these unconventional troops is Sir John Moore, and he is about to die creating the tactical foundation upon which every elite military unit, from the SAS to the Navy SEALs, would eventually be built. This is the story of a forgotten military genius whose innovations changed warfare forever, yet whose name has been overshadowed by more famous commanders who built upon his foundations. It's the story of how one man's tactical vision transformed a disaster into a victory, created the blueprint for modern light infantry operations, and established principles that continue to influence military thinking more than 2 centuries after his death. You need to understand the military world of 1808 to grasp the magnitude of what John Moore was attempting to achieve. For over a century, European warfare had been dominated by linear tactics that treated soldiers as interchangeable components in massive human machines. Armies fought in rigid formations, with thousands of men moving in perfect synchronization according to drill manuals that emphasized precision over adaptability. The typical European battle of the late 18th century resembled nothing so much as a deadly ballet, with opposing forces maneuvering in predetermined patterns until one side's discipline broke and retreat became rout. Victory went to the army that could maintain formation longest under fire, and individual initiative was not just discouraged, but actively punished as a threat to unit cohesion. This system had reached its apex under Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose military reforms had made the Prussian army the most feared force in Europe through relentless drill and iron discipline. Soldiers were trained to load and fire their muskets in perfect unison, to march in step across any terrain, and to obey orders without question or hesitation. It was warfare reduced to mathematics, where victory could be calculated based on the number of men in formation and their level of training. The French Revolution had begun to challenge these assumptions, introducing concepts of individual merit and national enthusiasm that had proven devastatingly effective against the professional armies of the old regime. Napoleon's early victories had demonstrated that motivated citizen soldiers could defeat the most perfectly drilled professionals, but even revolutionary France still fought according to fundamentally conventional principles. Napoleon's tactical system emphasized speed and concentration of force, But his armies still moved in traditional formations and fought according to established principles of linear warfare. His innovations were primarily organizational and logistical, the ability to move large forces quickly and concentrate them at decisive points, rather than fundamental changes in how individual soldiers fought. It was into this military environment that John Moore introduced ideas so radical that they seemed to violate the basic principles upon which all European military science was based. Moore believed that the future belonged not to perfectly drilled masses, but to small units of highly trained individuals who could think and fight independently, adapting to circumstances faster than any centralized command structure could respond. Moore's vision of warfare emphasized marksmanship over volume of fire, individual initiative over blind obedience, and tactical flexibility over rigid adherence to doctrine. He wanted to create soldiers who could operate effectively without direct supervision, who could read terrain and exploit opportunities that commanders miles away could never anticipate. Most revolutionary of all, Moore believed that effective soldiers needed to understand not just how to follow orders, but why those orders made tactical sense. He wanted thinking fighters rather than human automatons, men who could adapt their actions to changing circumstances without waiting for new instructions from higher authority. This philosophy represented a complete rejection of everything that 18th century military science considered fundamental. The idea that common soldiers could be trusted with tactical decisions, that individual initiative was more valuable than perfect drill, that small units could achieve effects beyond what their numbers would suggest. These concepts were so radical that most professional officers considered them not just wrong, but dangerous. John Moore himself was an unlikely candidate to become a military revolutionary. Born in Glasgow in 1761 to a family of modest means, he had entered the army at age 14 as an ensign in the 51st Foot, beginning a military career that would span over 3 decades. His early service in the American Revolutionary War had exposed him to the kind of irregular warfare that most European officers dismissed as beneath their notice. But Moore had paid attention to what he saw in America. He had watched British regulars, trained to fight in perfect formations, struggle against continental forces that refused to fight according to European rules. He had seen how American riflemen, operating in small groups with minimal supervision, could inflict casualties far beyond what their numbers should have allowed. Most importantly, he had observed that rigid adherence to conventional tactics often proved counterproductive when facing unconventional enemies. The lesson that Moore drew from the American experience was that warfare was evolving in directions that traditional military education had not anticipated. The enemies that European armies would face in the future would not always be conventional forces willing to fight set-piece battles according to established rules. Victory would increasingly depend on tactical flexibility and the ability to adapt to unexpected situations. Moore's subsequent service in Ireland during the 1798 rebellion reinforced these conclusions. Irish insurgents, who should have been easily defeated by professional British forces, proved remarkably effective when they abandoned conventional tactics and fought according to their own rules. British units trained for European warfare found themselves struggling against an enemy that appeared everywhere and nowhere, striking without warning and disappearing before conventional forces could respond. It was during the Irish campaign that Moore began developing the tactical concepts that would eventually revolutionize military science. He started experimenting with small unit operations, training selected soldiers to operate independently behind enemy lines, and developing techniques for gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy operations through unconventional means. These experiments were largely ignored by Moore's superiors, who remained convinced that conventional tactics would eventually prove effective against any enemy. But Moore continued refining his ideas, convinced that the future of warfare lay in the direction of increased tactical flexibility and individual initiative. The opportunity to test these theories on a larger scale came in 1803 when Moore was appointed to command a training camp at Shorncliffe in Kent. Officially, the camp was established to prepare British forces for the invasion of England that Napoleon was believed to be planning. Unofficially, it became the laboratory where Moore would develop the tactical innovations that would change warfare forever. The soldiers who arrived at Shorncliffe were typical products of the British military system, men recruited from the lowest levels of society, trained through harsh discipline and repetitive drill to function as components in massive military machines. Most had never fired their weapons at anything smaller than a barn door, had never been expected to think for themselves, and had never operated beyond the immediate supervision of their officers. Moore set out to transform these men into something entirely different. Soldiers who could think and fight independently, who understood the principles behind their actions, and who could adapt to unexpected situations without losing effectiveness. It was an ambitious goal that required fundamental changes in training methods, equipment, and military culture. The first innovation was in marksmanship training. While most European armies still treated firearms as area weapons designed to deliver volume of fire against large targets, Moore insisted that his soldiers learn to shoot accurately at individual targets. He established rifle ranges where men practiced hitting specific marks at distances that conventional military wisdom considered impossible for infantry weapons. This emphasis on marksmanship required fundamental changes in equipment. The smoothbore muskets that equipped most European armies were effective only at short ranges and were notoriously inaccurate even under ideal conditions. Moore equipped his experimental units with rifles, weapons that were far more accurate, but also more expensive and slower to load than conventional muskets. The decision to arm infantry with rifles was controversial because it violated established military doctrine about the role of foot soldiers in battle. Rifles were traditionally used only by specialists like hunters and scouts, not by regular infantry who were expected to deliver massed volleys rather than aimed shots. Moore's critics argued that the slower rate of fire would make rifle-armed units vulnerable to conventional forces that could deliver more shots per minute. Moore disagreed, believing that accuracy was more important than volume of fire, especially when fighting in the kind of small unit actions that he anticipated would characterize future warfare. A soldier who could hit his target with his first shot was more effective than 10 men firing blindly into the air, regardless of how quickly they could reload. The training program that Moore developed at Shorncliffe went far beyond marksmanship to encompass everything from physical conditioning to tactical decision-making. His soldiers learned to move quickly across difficult terrain, to fight effectively in small groups without direct supervision, and to gather and report intelligence about enemy movements and positions. Perhaps most revolutionary was Moore's approach to military discipline and leadership. Instead of the harsh punishments and blind obedience that characterized most European armies, Moore emphasized understanding and initiative. His soldiers were expected to know not just what they were supposed to do, but why they were doing it, so they could adapt their actions to changing circumstances. This required a completely different relationship between officers and enlisted men than existed in conventional armies. Moore's officers were expected to be teachers and leaders rather than mere disciplinarians, capable of explaining tactical principles and inspiring confidence rather than simply enforcing obedience through fear. The men who emerged from Shorncliffe training were unlike any soldiers that European armies had previously produced. They could march faster and farther than conventional infantry, shoot more accurately, and operate effectively in small groups that could coordinate their actions without constant supervision. Most importantly, they could think and adapt, responding to unexpected situations faster than any centralized command structure could react. Moore's experimental units were designated as light infantry to distinguish them from the conventional line infantry that formed the backbone of European armies. But this terminology understated the revolutionary nature of what Moore had created. These weren't simply lighter versions of conventional soldiers, but an entirely new type of military force designed for a different kind of warfare. The opportunity to test these innovations came in 1808, when Napoleon's invasion of Spain created an opportunity for British intervention on the European continent. The Peninsular War, as it would become known, provided exactly the kind of irregular warfare environment where Moore's tactical innovations could prove their worth. Spain in 1808 was a military situation unlike anything that European armies had previously encountered. The Spanish regular army had been destroyed in a series of conventional battles, but Spanish resistance continued through guerrilla warfare that confounded French forces trained for traditional European combat. British forces operating in this environment would need to adapt to a form of warfare that bore little resemblance to the set-piece battles that dominated military thinking. Moore was appointed to command British forces in Spain with instructions to support Spanish resistance and, if possible, drive French forces out of the Iberian Peninsula. It was an ambitious mission that would require exactly the kind of tactical flexibility that Moore had been developing at Shorncliffe. The force that Moore commanded in Spain included both conventional British units and the light infantry that he had trained according to his revolutionary principles. This combination would allow him to test his tactical innovations under combat conditions while maintaining the capability to fight conventional battles when necessary. The campaign that followed demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Moore's approach to warfare. His light infantry units proved remarkably effective at gathering intelligence, harassing French communications, and conducting the kind of small unit operations that conventional forces found difficult to counter. They could appear anywhere on the battlefield, strike with devastating effect, and disappear before French forces could organize effective responses. But Moore's innovations were still experimental, and not all of his tactical concepts had been fully developed or tested under combat conditions. The integration of light infantry tactics with conventional military operations required careful coordination that was often difficult to achieve in the confusion of active campaigning. The Spanish campaign also revealed the political and logistical challenges of implementing revolutionary military concepts in the middle of an ongoing war. Moore's superiors in London expected conventional results achieved through conventional methods, while Spanish allies often failed to understand or support tactical innovations that seemed to violate established military principles. Despite these challenges, Moore's forces achieved remarkable success during the early phases of the Peninsular War. His light infantry units disrupted French operations across a wide area, gathered intelligence that proved invaluable for strategic planning, and demonstrated the effectiveness of small unit tactics against conventional forces. The psychological impact on French forces was particularly significant. Soldiers who had conquered most of Europe through conventional warfare found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. British units appeared where they weren't expected, struck at vulnerable points, and vanished before French forces could respond effectively. French commanders, trained in the tactical methods that had proved successful across Europe, struggled to develop effective responses to Moore's innovations. Conventional countermeasures proved ineffective against an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles, while attempts to adapt French tactics to the new conditions often failed because French soldiers lacked the training and equipment necessary for irregular warfare. The climax of Moore's Spanish campaign came during the winter of 1808-1809 when French forces under Marshal Nicolas Soult launched a major offensive designed to drive British forces from the Iberian Peninsula. Outnumbered and operating far from their bases of supply, Moore's forces faced potential annihilation if they attempted to fight a conventional defensive battle. Instead, Moore implemented a fighting withdrawal that demonstrated the full potential of his tactical innovations. Rather than retreating in the rigid formations that characterized conventional military movements, his forces conducted a series of delaying actions that used terrain and tactical flexibility to offset French numerical superiority. The light infantry units that Moore had trained at Shorncliffe proved their worth during this retreat, conducting reconnaissance missions that provided early warning of French movements, harassing enemy supply lines, and fighting delaying actions that slowed French pursuit without becoming decisively engaged. Their ability to operate independently allowed Moore to maintain tactical flexibility while preserving his forces for the decisive engagement that he knew would eventually come. The retreat to Corunna became a masterpiece of military movement that demonstrated principles that would influence military thinking for centuries to come. Moore's forces covered over 250 miles of difficult terrain in the middle of winter, maintaining unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness despite constant pressure from pursuing French forces. The key to this achievement was the tactical flexibility that Moore's training had developed. Instead of moving in rigid formations that could be easily predicted and intercepted, British forces adapted their movements to terrain and tactical opportunities. Light infantry units provided security and intelligence, while conventional forces maintained the disciplined movement necessary for an organized withdrawal. French forces found themselves unable to bring Moore's army to decisive battle because the British refused to fight according to conventional rules. Every time French commanders thought they had trapped British forces, Moore's tactical flexibility allowed him to escape through maneuvers that conventional military doctrine declared impossible. The retreat also demonstrated the psychological advantages of troops who understood the principles behind their actions. Moore's soldiers knew why they were moving in particular directions, what they were trying to achieve, and how their individual actions contributed to the larger tactical picture. This understanding maintained morale and effectiveness even under the most adverse conditions. By the time Moore's forces reached Corunna, they had accomplished something that military theorists had considered impossible: conducting a successful fighting withdrawal against superior forces while maintaining unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness. The tactical innovations that Moore had developed were proving their worth under the most demanding conditions imaginable. But the real test was yet to come. At Corunna, Moore would have to fight the kind of defensive battle that would either validate his revolutionary approach to warfare or result in the destruction of his entire force. The French army that had been pursuing him was not just larger, but included some of Napoleon's finest troops, veterans of campaigns across Europe who had never been defeated by British forces. The Battle of Corunna began on January 16, 1809, when French forces under Marshal Soult launched what they expected to be the final assault against a trapped British army. Soult had positioned his forces to prevent any possible escape, confident that conventional tactics would prove decisive against British forces that had already been weakened by weeks of difficult campaigning. What Soult encountered instead was a defensive system unlike anything in French military experience. Moore's forces fought according to principles that emphasized flexibility over rigidity, individual initiative over mass formation, and tactical adaptation over blind adherence to doctrine. The result was a battle that confounded French expectations and demonstrated the revolutionary potential of Moore's approach to warfare. The light infantry units that formed the core of Moore's tactical system proved their worth during the battle, conducting operations that conventional military wisdom declared impossible. Small groups of British soldiers operating independently achieved effects far beyond what their numbers should have allowed, disrupting French attacks and creating opportunities for counter-offensives that larger forces exploited with devastating effectiveness. French forces found themselves fighting not one coherent enemy, but dozens of small units that appeared to coordinate their actions through some invisible means. Every time French commanders thought they understood the British defensive plan, new threats would emerge from unexpected directions, forcing constant tactical adjustments that prevented the development of sustained offensive pressure. The battle demonstrated principles that would eventually become fundamental to modern military doctrine: the importance of individual initiative, the value of small unit tactics, and the decisive advantage that tactical flexibility provides over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Moore's forces achieved these advantages through training and equipment innovations that conventional armies had not yet adopted. But victory came at an enormous personal cost. During the final phase of the battle, Moore was struck by a French cannonball that inflicted wounds that would prove fatal. He died knowing that his tactical innovations had succeeded, that his forces had defeated French attacks, and that the principles he had developed would survive to influence future military operations. Moore's death at Corunna marked the end of his personal involvement in military innovation, but it also marked the beginning of his influence on military science. The tactical principles that he had developed and tested under combat conditions would be studied, refined, and eventually adopted by military forces around the world. The immediate impact of Moore's innovations was felt throughout the British Army, which began implementing light infantry tactics across all its units. The success at Corunna had demonstrated that Moore's methods were not just experimental curiosities, but practical solutions to the tactical challenges that modern warfare presented. But the influence of Moore's ideas extended far beyond the British military. French commanders, having experienced the effectiveness of light infantry tactics firsthand, began developing their own versions of small unit operations. Other European armies, learning about Moore's success through intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations, started experimenting with similar approaches to training and tactics. The Peninsular War continued for several years after Moore's death, providing additional opportunities to test and refine the tactical innovations that he had introduced. British forces under the Duke of Wellington built upon Moore's foundations, developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to irregular warfare that would eventually drive French forces from Spain entirely. Wellington's success in the Peninsular War owed much to the tactical principles that Moore had established. The light infantry units that Moore had trained continued to provide intelligence, harassment, and small unit operations that complemented Wellington's strategic brilliance. The combination of innovative tactics and strategic vision proved devastatingly effective against French forces that remained committed to conventional approaches. But perhaps the most important legacy of Moore's innovations was their influence on military thinking beyond the immediate context of the Napoleonic Wars. The principles that Moore had established, emphasis on individual initiative, small unit tactics, and tactical flexibility, would eventually become fundamental to all modern military operations. The development of special forces units during the 20th century drew directly on the tactical concepts that Moore had pioneered. From the British SAS to the American Green Berets, elite military units have consistently emphasized the same principles that Moore first implemented at Shorncliffe: superior training, individual initiative, and the ability to operate effectively in small groups without direct supervision. Modern military doctrine across all services reflects Moore's influence in its emphasis on adaptability, independent thinking, and the importance of individual competence. The rigid formations and blind obedience that characterized 18th century warfare have given way to flexible organizations that can respond rapidly to changing conditions. The equipment innovations that Moore pioneered also had lasting influence on military development. His emphasis on marksmanship and individual weapons accuracy led eventually to the development of modern small arms that prioritize precision over volume of fire. The rifles that his light infantry used were the ancestors of the sophisticated individual weapons that equip modern military forces. Perhaps most importantly, Moore's approach to military training and leadership established principles that continue to influence military education around the world. His belief that soldiers needed to understand the principles behind their actions, rather than simply following orders blindly, became the foundation for modern military training programs that emphasize critical thinking and tactical decision-making. The leadership principles that Moore established, treating soldiers as thinking individuals rather than interchangeable components, revolutionized military culture in ways that extended far beyond tactical considerations. His approach created military organizations that could adapt and innovate, rather than simply executing predetermined plans. But Moore's innovations were not without their critics and limitations. Conservative military officers argued that his emphasis on individual initiative would undermine military discipline and create chaos on the battlefield. Some believed that conventional tactics, properly applied, would always prove superior to experimental methods that violated established military principles. These criticisms were not entirely without merit. Moore's tactical innovations required soldiers of exceptional quality and training, resources that were not always available in the quantities necessary for large-scale implementation. The light infantry that he had trained at Shorncliffe represented years of careful selection and intensive training that could not be quickly replicated across entire armies. The integration of light infantry tactics with conventional military operations also presented challenges that Moore had not fully resolved before his death. Coordination between different types of units required communication and command structures that did not always function effectively under combat conditions. Moreover, Moore's innovations were developed primarily for the specific conditions of irregular warfare that characterized the Peninsular War. Their effectiveness against conventional European armies fighting traditional battles remained largely theoretical at the time of Moore's death. Despite these limitations, the fundamental principles that Moore established proved remarkably durable and adaptable to changing military conditions. Subsequent military leaders built upon his foundations, addressing the practical challenges of implementation while preserving the essential insights that made his approach revolutionary. The American Civil War provided additional testing for Moore's concepts as both Union and Confederate forces experimented with light infantry tactics and small unit operations. The effectiveness of these methods in the American context validated Moore's belief that his innovations had universal application rather than being limited to specific geographical or tactical situations. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 saw further development of Moore's ideas as Prussian forces incorporated light infantry principles into their overall tactical doctrine. The success of these adaptations demonstrated that Moore's innovations could be successfully integrated with conventional military operations when properly implemented. By the end of the 19th century, virtually every major military force in the world had adopted some version of the tactical principles that Moore had pioneered. Light infantry units had become standard components of military organizations, while emphasis on individual training and tactical flexibility had transformed military culture across all services. The First World War presented new challenges that required further evolution of Moore's concepts. The static nature of trench warfare initially seemed to contradict his emphasis on mobility and flexibility, but specialized units trained according to his principles proved essential for operations like trench raids and reconnaissance missions. The development of stormtrooper tactics by German forces during the First World War drew directly on principles that Moore had established, demonstrating that his innovations could be adapted to meet the requirements of industrial warfare. The emphasis on small unit operations and individual initiative proved as relevant to 20th century combat as it had been to Napoleonic warfare. The Second World War saw the full flowering of Moore's legacy in the form of specialized units that operated entirely according to the principles he had established. British commandos, American Rangers, and similar forces around the world all traced their tactical heritage directly to the innovations that Moore had pioneered at Shorncliffe. These units demonstrated that Moore's vision of elite soldiers operating independently behind enemy lines was not just tactically feasible, but strategically decisive. Operations like the raids on Saint-Nazaire and Dieppe, while costly, proved that small forces using Moore's methods could achieve effects far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The Pacific War provided additional validation for Moore's concepts, as jungle warfare required exactly the kind of tactical flexibility and individual initiative that his training had emphasized. American and British forces operating in the Pacific drew extensively on light infantry principles that could be traced directly to Moore's innovations. The development of airborne forces during the Second World War represented perhaps the ultimate expression of Moore's tactical vision. Paratroopers operating behind enemy lines embodied everything that Moore had envisioned. Elite soldiers trained to operate independently, equipped with superior weapons and capable of achieving decisive results through tactical innovation rather than numerical superiority. The Cold War era saw further refinement of Moore's concepts through the development of special forces units designed for unconventional warfare operations. The American Green Berets, British SAS, and similar units around the world all drew on the tactical principles that Moore had established, adapting them to meet the requirements of counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare. These units demonstrated that Moore's emphasis on cultural understanding and local cooperation was as important as tactical innovation. Modern special forces operations require exactly the kind of individual initiative and adaptive thinking that Moore had first identified as essential to effective military operations. The technological revolution in military affairs during the late 20th century initially seemed to challenge Moore's emphasis on individual soldiers and small unit operations. Precision-guided weapons and satellite communications appeared to favor centralized control and technological superiority over individual competence and tactical flexibility. But subsequent conflicts demonstrated that technology could not replace the human factors that Moore had identified as decisive. Operations in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan showed that individual soldier quality and small unit effectiveness remained as important as ever, regardless of technological advances. Modern military operations in urban environments and counterinsurgency campaigns have validated virtually every aspect of Moore's tactical vision. The emphasis on individual marksmanship, small unit operations, and cultural understanding that he pioneered has proved essential to success in contemporary military operations. The influence of Moore's innovations extends beyond strictly military applications to include law enforcement and security operations. SWAT teams, counter-terrorism units, and special police forces all employ tactical methods that can be traced directly to principles that Moore established more than 2 centuries ago. But perhaps the most important legacy of Moore's work lies in its demonstration that military innovation can emerge from careful analysis of changing conditions rather than blind adherence to established doctrine. His willingness to question fundamental assumptions about warfare and develop new approaches based on empirical observation established a pattern of military thinking that continues to influence professional military education. Modern military leaders are trained to think critically about tactical problems, to question established solutions, and to develop innovative approaches when circumstances require them. This intellectual approach to military problems reflects the influence of Moore's example more than 2 centuries after his death. The leadership principles that Moore established, treating subordinates as thinking individuals capable of independent action, have become fundamental to modern military culture. The idea that effective military organizations must be learning organizations that can adapt and innovate reflects insights that Moore first developed during his experiments at Shorncliffe. Educational. Institutions like the United States Military Academy at West Point and the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst continue to teach tactical principles that draw directly on Moore's innovations. Case studies of his campaigns remain standard components of military education curricula around the world. The international influence of Moore's ideas demonstrates their universal applicability to military problems. Military forces as diverse as the Israeli Defense Forces, the German Bundeswehr, and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces all employ tactical methods that reflect principles Moore established during the Napoleonic era. But recognizing Moore's influence on modern military science should not obscure the costs of his innovations or the challenges they presented to military organizations. The transition from conventional to light infantry tactics required fundamental changes in military culture that were often difficult to implement and sustain. The personnel requirements for Moore's approach to warfare, highly trained, independently thinking soldiers, represented a significant departure from traditional military practice. Creating and maintaining such forces required resources and institutional commitment that not all military organizations possessed. The integration of elite units with conventional forces also presented ongoing challenges that military organizations continue to address. Balancing the need for specialized capabilities with the requirements of large-scale conventional operations remains a fundamental problem in military organization. Moreover, the success of Moore's innovations created expectations that were not always realistic given available resources and strategic circumstances. The effectiveness of small unit operations in specific contexts did not necessarily translate to broader strategic success, as subsequent military history would demonstrate. The mythology that grew up around elite military units sometimes obscured the reality that their effectiveness depended on careful integration with conventional forces and appropriate strategic employment. Moore's own success at Corunna, while tactically brilliant, did not achieve broader strategic objectives in the Peninsular War. These limitations should not diminish recognition of Moore's fundamental contributions to military science, but they do provide important context for understanding both the potential and the constraints of his innovations. The principles he established remain valid, but their application requires careful consideration of specific circumstances and strategic objectives. The personal cost of Moore's innovations also deserves recognition. His death at Corunna represented not just the loss of a brilliant military leader, but the interruption of an intellectual process that might have led to even more significant developments in military science. The soldiers who served under Moore and implemented his tactical innovations also paid significant costs, both in terms of the physical demands of their training and the psychological stress of operating according to principles that differed significantly from conventional military practice. But these costs must be weighed against the benefits that Moore's innovations provided to military effectiveness and, ultimately, to the preservation of democratic values during one of the most challenging periods in European history. His tactical developments contributed significantly to the eventual defeat of Napoleon and the preservation of the political systems that would evolve into modern democratic societies. The Battle of Corunna, where Moore died implementing his revolutionary tactics, demonstrated that innovation and sacrifice could achieve results that conventional wisdom declared impossible. 6,000 British soldiers, fighting according to Moore's principles, defeated 15,000 French troops using conventional tactics, validating his belief that quality could overcome quantity when properly organized and led. This achievement resonated far beyond its immediate tactical significance, inspiring confidence in the possibility of military innovation and encouraging subsequent generations of military leaders to question established doctrine when circumstances required new approaches. The influence of Moore's example on subsequent military leaders can be traced through the careers of officers who served under him and later applied his principles in their own commands. The Duke of Wellington, Sir Harry Smith, and Sir John Colborne all drew on lessons learned during the Peninsular War to achieve success in subsequent conflicts. The intellectual tradition that Moore established, the belief that military problems require careful analysis and innovative solutions, became a defining characteristic of British military culture that influenced operations from the Crimean War through the world wars of the 20th century. International military exchanges and professional education programs spread Moore's ideas beyond the British military to influence military development around the world. His tactical principles were studied and adapted by military organizations across Europe, America, and eventually Asia and Africa. The democratic implications of Moore's approach to military organization also deserve recognition. His emphasis on individual initiative and critical thinking created military organizations that were more compatible with democratic values than the rigid hierarchies that characterized traditional armies. Soldiers trained according to Moore's principles were more likely to function effectively as citizens in democratic societies, having learned to think independently and take responsibility for their actions. This connection between military service and civic responsibility reflected Enlightenment values that Moore had absorbed during his intellectual development. The continuing relevance of Moore's innovations in contemporary military operations demonstrates the enduring value of his contributions to military science. Modern conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other challenging environments have validated virtually every aspect of his tactical vision. Special operations forces operating in these environments employ methods that Moore would recognize, even though the technological context has changed dramatically since the Napoleonic era. The emphasis on individual competence, small unit operations, and cultural understanding remains as relevant today as it was more than 2 centuries ago. But perhaps the most important lesson from Moore's career lies in its demonstration that military innovation requires intellectual courage as well as physical bravery. His willingness to challenge established doctrine and experiment with new approaches in the face of institutional resistance established a pattern of military thinking that continues to influence professional development. Modern military education emphasizes critical thinking and innovation, partly because Moore's example demonstrated that military effectiveness depends on the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, rather than simply implementing predetermined solutions. The technological revolution in military affairs that has characterized the late 20th and early 21st centuries requires exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that Moore pioneered. Military organizations must constantly evolve to address new threats and exploit new capabilities, a process that demands the intellectual flexibility that Moore first identified as essential. The legacy of Sir John Moore extends far beyond the specific tactical innovations that he developed to encompass fundamental insights about the nature of military effectiveness in a changing world. His recognition that individual competence and organizational flexibility were more important than numerical superiority or technological advantage established principles that remain relevant regardless of specific technological or strategic circumstances. The Battle of Corunna, where Moore died on January 16, 1809, marked the end of his personal contribution to military innovation, but the beginning of his influence on military science. The tactical principles that he established during his brief career would influence military thinking for centuries to come, shaping the development of elite military units and special operations capabilities that continue to be decisive in contemporary conflicts. Modern soldiers operating in the mountains of Afghanistan or the cities of Iraq employ tactical methods that draw directly on innovations that Moore pioneered more than 2 centuries ago. The rifles they carry are sophisticated descendants of the weapons that Moore's light infantry used at Corunna. The emphasis on individual marksmanship, small unit operations, and tactical flexibility that characterizes modern military training reflects principles that Moore first established at Shorncliffe. But Moore's most important legacy may be his demonstration that military effectiveness depends ultimately on human factors rather than technological or numerical advantages. His success in creating elite military units through superior training and leadership established a pattern that continues to influence military organizations around the world. The forgotten general who invented modern special forces achieved something that few military leaders accomplish: fundamental innovation that changed the nature of warfare itself. His tactical developments provided the foundation upon which all subsequent elite military units would be built, establishing principles that remain as relevant today as they were during the Napoleonic era. The mathematical impossibility that Moore overcame at Corunna, 6,000 British soldiers defeating 15,000 French troops, demonstrated that superior tactics and training could overcome overwhelming numerical odds when properly applied. It was a lesson that would inspire military leaders for generations to come and validate the belief that human ingenuity and courage could triumph over seemingly insurmountable challenges. Sir John Moore died knowing that his innovations had succeeded, that the principles he had developed would survive to influence future military operations, and that the soldiers he had trained would carry forward the tactical revolution that he had begun. His legacy lives on in every special operations unit that employs the methods he pioneered, in every military organization that emphasizes individual excellence and tactical innovation, and in every soldier who understands that victory depends on the quality of people and ideas rather than the quantity of resources. The revolutionary tactics that Moore developed changed warfare forever, but his most important contribution may have been his demonstration that military innovation is always possible when leaders possess the intellectual courage to question established assumptions and the practical skill to develop new solutions. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was more than 2 centuries ago, when a forgotten general created the foundation for modern special forces and changed the course of military history forever.